Hello, 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 and welcome back to Behind the Walls of the World Psychiatric Hospitals. I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Gallup, and today I have another story for you about a former patient of Trenton Psychiatric Hospital. This is one patient that you may be familiar with. It's the true story of John Forbes Nash, who is the inspiration for the film A Beautiful Mind. John Nash was an incredible mathematician who was also diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia in his early 30s. The movie offered a lovely representation of his struggle with mental illness, but it doesn't tell the complete story, and it offered some creative differences. What I love about the film is how the storyline essentially keeps the viewer in the dark about Nash's mental illness until the point that he's hospitalized. This is so well done and nicely represents the way that many folks with schizophrenia feel. Their experiences seem normal to them, and they can feel like they're being held against their will when they're being hospitalized. This was very true for the story of John Nash. So come on in and get comfortable as we go behind the walls of Trenton Psychiatric Hospital. John Forbes Nash was born on June 13, 1928, in Bluefield, New Jersey. His father was described as a quiet engineer with an inquisitive mind, while his mother, Virginia, was described as an intelligent former teacher. As a boy, Nash was described by others as solitary, bookish, and introverted, and his mother had big dreams for him. She pushed him to read by age 4 and taught him Latin. Eventually, he would go on to skip a grade. While he was still in elementary school, Nash's teacher was concerned that he wasn't properly learning how to solve math problems. She called his mother, Virginia, in for a meeting, concerned that her son was falling behind. Virginia looked at her son's work and laughed. He was simply finding his own way to arrive at the answer. He didn't follow the traditional rules. In fact, someone in elementary school suggested that he be called Bug Brains because he had good ideas, but they were buggy or not particularly sound. But there was young Nash, solving math problems with larger numbers than the rest of his peers. By the time he was in high school, Nash had read the book Men of Mathematics by E.T. Bell. He had hoped to become an engineer like his father, so he and his family were proud when he was one of 10 national recipients of the George Westinghouse Award, which offered him a full scholarship to the Carnegie Institute of Technology. Once he was admitted, he went back and forth between an engineering and chemistry major before finally landing on mathematics. He graduated from Carnegie and was accepted to Princeton University, which was known at the time to have the most elite mathematics department in the world. Each student was hand-picked to be there. His advisor from Carnegie wrote a one-sentence recommendation for him that read simply, "This man is a genius." The problem was that Nash rarely went to class. He said it would blunt his originality, and he rarely studied, saying that he didn't want to simply copy what others had done. So he was always on the hunt for problems that had stumped other mathematicians. He ended up creating a board game while he was at Princeton that became an instant hit with other students. In the film A Beautiful Mind, there's a board game that Nash and his rival play a couple of times. It isn't explicitly stated that this is the game that Nash created, but I think it's supposed to represent that game. People at Princeton described Nash as brilliant and odd. In the quad, he rode a bike in figure eights over and over and over, and was seen pacing the hallways while whistling Bach's Little Fugue. What John Nash began studying while at Princeton, however, was a math topic that was really in vogue at the time, game theory. Some people called it the flashiest, sexiest theory to be studying. I am by no means qualified to properly discuss the economics behind game theory, but I'll do my best. Game theory essentially looked at the different strategies used in everyday games like chess or checkers or whatever, and he analyzed the strategies that people use to win competitive games and ended up writing his doctoral dissertation on the subject. He called this theory the Nash equilibrium. In the film, he has an epiphany while out at a bar with his friends. A group of women enters the bar, a beautiful blonde and her entourage, And Nash's character says that if all of his friends go for the blonde, they'll all lose. But if they all avoid the blonde and go for her friends, everyone will end up with someone. I'm not really sure if this is how he landed on his game theory strategy, but it was a nice story point in the film. He earned his PhD in 1950, and basically, life moved on after that. By 1951, John Nash had been hired on as a faculty member at MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He was so young that people called him Kid Professor, but he also earned another type of reputation. People who worked with him there described him as, quote, very brash, boastful, selfish, egocentric, end quote. In the film, he's depicted as more aloof and socially awkward, but people who worked with him seemed to think of him more as like a narcissist who genuinely thought he was superior to others. Not depicted in the film was a relationship Nash had with a nurse named Eleanor Steyer. They dated for a few months before Eleanor discovered that she was pregnant with his child. Nash, however, refused to have his name put on the child's birth certificate or financially support him. As a result, their son, named John David Steyer, was placed in foster care for most of his childhood. Throughout his 20s, Nash worked hard to make a name for himself in the field of mathematics. His goal was to earn the coveted Fields Medal, which was given to the top contributor in the field. Year after year, Nash went unrecognized for his work. He was determined to solve the Riemann hypothesis, which I won't pretend to understand as, something to do with prime numbers. I don't know. He worried that he was past his prime as a mathematician. I didn't realize this until my research for this episode, but apparently mathematicians sort of age out around 30, much like professional athletes do. And I'm not really sure the reason for this, but Nash was very cognizant of his aging. Not long after he began working at MIT, Nash began teaching a course where he would meet one of his students, Alicia Landé, who was a physics major. Alicia wanted to become another Marie Curie, so Nash's ambition was attractive to her. For Nash, he was attracted to the fact that she was different. She thought differently, and she was from El Salvador, which was particularly unique to him. They were married in February 1957 in a small ceremony in Washington, D.C. Some people say it was around this time that Nash seemed to lose his grip on reality. He became incredibly stressed out about not getting top recognition for his work in math, and he was obsessed with solving the Riemann hypothesis. And spoiler alert, he didn't end up solving it. The Riemann hypothesis went unsolved until 2013, when Yitang Zhang solved it. But there were signs that Nash was starting to unravel. For instance, at a New Year's Eve party in 1958, John and Alicia Nash went to a costume party. John dressed up as a baby. He wore an oversized diaper and spent much of the night curled up on Alicia's lap crying. It seemed odd, to say the least. And what's more, it was around this time that Alicia found out she was pregnant. A few weeks later, Nash rushed into the common room at MIT and announced that powers from outer space were sending him coded messages in the New York Times. And he fully believed that these aliens were intent on destroying his career. He later interrupted a lecture to say he was on the cover of Life magazine disguised as Pope John the 23rd because 23 was his favorite prime number. He later began believing that men on campus who wore red ties were part of a secret communist organization that was out to get him. When Nash was offered a prestigious position at the University of Chicago, he declined, saying that he was already scheduled to be the emperor of Antarctica. So let's pause here for a moment and look at some of the symptoms that Nash is displaying. In the span of about 2 months, from late December 1957 to February 1958, he began experiencing what appears to be his first psychotic break. We see paranoid delusions, that outside forces, whether communists or aliens from outer space, are out to get him and destroy his career. We see what are called ideas of reference. these beliefs that newspapers are sending him coded messages or that he's the Pope because 23 is his favorite number. We can see in retrospect that these are odd beliefs that most likely weren't true. But for Nash, they seem to be very real, and he was urgent that he share those ideas with others. One of the aspects that the film captures so well is the fear that Nash had regarding his delusional beliefs. And this is what I see in my patients who have delusions. As a psychologist, I don't pay a whole lot of attention to what the delusions are because the content doesn't often matter. What matters are the emotions that come up as a result of them. And most often, people feel very afraid. Most of the patients I've worked with who have killed someone because of their delusions felt like they had no other choice. It was either kill or be killed in their mind. And they described their offense as being the most terrifying moment of their life. This is what the film, and particularly Russell Crowe, captures perfectly. That feeling of desperation that someone needs to believe me. And if you rewatch the film after this, and I encourage you to do so, watch for the feelings that Russell Crowe portrays. It's spot on. Anytime he is afraid or angry, I feel like I see my patients in him. Alicia Nash said that her husband's personality changed within a week after his symptoms started, and she grew afraid. By February 1958, Nash was relieved of his teaching duties at MIT. Not long after that, he stayed up all night painting black spots all over the bedroom wall. At first, Alicia tried to manage his odd behavior by herself, but she eventually consulted with a psychiatrist who recommended hospitalization. And so, Nash was sent to McLean Hospital. McLean Hospital was known for treating the rich and famous. Treatment consisted mostly of Thorazine, a heavy-duty antipsychotic, and psychoanalysis. Nash's friends and colleagues continued to support him even after his hospitalization, but many still had questions. One of his visitors asked him how he, a mathematician and someone committed to rationality, could honestly believe that aliens were communicating with him. And Nash responded that the ideas had come to him the same way his math ideas did, so he believed them. He had no reason not to. Nash's mother came to visit him when he was at McLean, but the visit apparently broke her. She felt she had failed as a mother. Other colleagues mourned the loss of a great mind. It had been that same year in 1958 that Fortune magazine had named 30-year-old Nash as one of the most promising mathematicians in the world. The great John Nash, now reduced to a psychotic mess. What a tragedy. Nash hired a lawyer who was able to have him successfully discharged after 50 days of treatment. After being released, Nash said, quote, "A delusional state of mind is like living in a dream. Well, I knew where I was there on observation, but I was able to think that I was like a victim of conspiracy. I saw myself as some sort of messenger," end quote. Alicia had given birth to a son, John Charles Nash, while Nash was at McLean. But as soon as her husband had been discharged, she resigned from MIT, withdrew his pension, and fled to Europe. Unsure of what exactly to do, Alicia left her newborn son with her mother and followed her husband. They arrived in Paris in July 1959. The city was ablaze due to protests regarding the nuclear arms race, so they were mostly forced to stay inside. A week later, however, Nash took off on his own to Luxembourg. While he was there, he tried to give up his U.S. citizenship, but was turned away. He then left Luxembourg and went to Geneva, where he thought of a way to be a refugee. After all, Geneva was known as a city of refuge, and he believed himself to be fleeing from communists. He kept trying to renounce his U.S. citizenship while there as well. Meanwhile, he had a naval attaché chasing him around Europe, trying to secure his passport in order to return it to Alicia for safekeeping. Nash ended up wandering around Europe for 9 months before the American embassy had him deported back to the U.S. He was sent back on a ship in chains and said he felt like a slave. When he returned to Boston, he was offered work with no heavy responsibilities from his former colleagues, but he refused to sign W-4 forms, saying there was a government conspiracy against him. Clearly, the paranoid delusions had not gone away. Nash also became obsessed with ongoing unrest in the Middle East. He made endless phone calls to friends and family, giving false names each time and talking about government conspiracies and nonsense about the Middle East. People who remember these calls say he would go on, pretending to be someone else, even though they knew it was him. One day, Nash showed up on the Princeton campus with scratches all over him and visibly terrified. Johann von Nassau has been a bad boy, he said. They're going to come and get me now. This wasn't the first time Nash had referred to himself as Johann von Nassau, but it was certainly the most alarming circumstance. Over 2 years after he had discharged from McLean Hospital in January 1961, Nash was admitted to the New Jersey State Hospital at Trenton. Unlike at McLean, at Trenton, Nash was given a patient number, mocked by his peers, and told to sweep the floors. He was unhappy to be housed with so many common people, just one of 50 on a unit or so, and didn't they realize who he was? Not long after his admission to Trenton, it was decided that Nash would undergo insulin treatment. We haven't really discussed this in depth yet, but insulin shock treatment was commonly used in the 1950s and 60s. It was a brutal, dangerous, and inhumane method of attempting to treat psychosis. According to the documentary A Brilliant Madness, quote, insulin coma was developed under the mistaken notion that schizophrenia was caused by metabolic problems, by the way the body regulates glucose, end quote. And so they believed that injecting a psychotic patient with insulin would effectively cure the underlying problem. A nurse would wake patients up early in the morning, administer a shot of insulin, and soon their blood sugar would drop, resulting in a coma. Some patients would remain in a coma, hovering just above death, while others would have grand mal seizures. Nash endured insulin shock treatments 5 days per week for 6 weeks. Nash would later say that he thankfully could not remember the treatments, only that it was similar to going under anesthetic. What it did make him think of were the cruel treatments toward animals. He felt like an animal experiment himself, and so Nash made the decision to become a vegetarian in a sort of protest against what the hospital was doing to him. After 6 months of treatment at Trenton, Nash was discharged back to the care of his family. They said he looked battered, like he had endured something devastating. The multiple treatments had wiped out some of his early memories, too. Ever so slowly, Nash pushed himself to get back to work. By 1961, he published his first paper in 4 years, this time on fluid dynamics. But he still struggled with his mental illness. He was on medications, but believed they didn't allow him to think like he usually did. He said, quote, sanity is a form of conformity, end quote. In fact, he seemed to prefer his symptoms and preferred to be unmedicated. He would later say, quote, it's not necessarily unpleasant to believe you're one of the most important people in the world, end quote. End quote. Mathematicians have a reputation to not do much after a certain age. By going into mental illness instead, I avoided going into a rut, end quote. It's an interesting perspective, but something that kept him going. He was given a research job at Princeton, which he kept, even though he left for Europe again. He wrote cryptic letters back home that scared his loved ones who received them. Alicia had had enough by that time of being afraid and bullied, so she filed for divorce in late 1961. Nash moved to Boston, where he got a place of his own. His colleagues set him up with a job at Brandeis University. He had weekly meetings with a psychiatrist who prescribed antipsychotics. Slowly, things started to improve. Nash began to stabilize and even started spending time with his first son, John David, and his former partner, Eleanor. His mood had improved and things were going well. People said he was a nicer person and his ego stuff was gone. But Nash continued to worry that his medications were negatively affecting his thinking. So in 1970, he discontinued them against medical advice. Pretty soon, his paranoia returned, and he started experiencing auditory hallucinations for the first time. Before long, he wasn't able to keep his job or his home. Faced with the choice to either let him roam the streets homeless or take him in, Alicia Nash decided to allow her ex-husband to stay with her as a boarder. She regretted having committed him almost 10 years earlier and decided he would be better treated with her. It was this decision that likely saved his life. Around Princeton, strange messages began showing up around campus. Codes would be written on chalkboards. Cryptic formulas would show up in classrooms. Rumors began to circulate about the origins of these mysterious messages. Students speculated that they were the work of a mysterious figure who wore red sneakers and kept to himself. They called him the Phantom. Word had it that the Phantom had gone mad because of a math problem that was too difficult for him to solve. Others said he'd gone mad because he'd tried to crack a code, but a rival beat him to it. Every once in a while, stacks of computations would show up in the mathematics department office. Nash later said, quote, "I felt that I might get a divine revelation by seeing a certain number. A great coincidence could be interpreted as a message from heaven," end quote. And so the Phantom roamed the Princeton campus for almost a decade, unaware that the work he'd done as a doctoral student decades earlier had sparked a revolution. Suddenly, economists were talking about Nash's game theory and applying it not only to board games, but also to real-world problems. Quote, "Mergers, strikes, collective bargaining, these situations of conflict and cooperation are part of the backbone of practical economics," it was said of his work. Auctions, farm subsidies, monetary policy, international trade, all were now seen as strategic games. And by the late 1970s, game theory had become one of the foundations of modern economics. And at the center was the Nash equilibrium, end quote. In 1978, Nash won the John von Neumann Theory Prize, which is an award given annually to one person who has made significant contributions to theory and operations research and the management sciences, whatever that means. John Nash had remained unmedicated since 1970, but by the end of the 1970s, he used the power of his mind to manage his symptoms of psychosis. He said he approached his mental illness with a scientist's mind. He said it was, quote, "the subconscious portion of my mind that is giving me bad ideas. I can do better thinking consciously. It should be superior to a voice," end quote. So he began rationalizing with his delusions and rejecting his voices, and somehow, over time, they seemed to diminish. He said, quote, "I willed it. I decided I was going to think rationally," end quote. He became more engaged with others and seemed to return to the world. All the while, he was still renting a room from his ex-wife, who remained his biggest supporter. By the 1980s, economists expected that game theory would or should win a Nobel Prize, but members of the Nobel Committee worried that Nash was still too psychiatrically unstable. Some wondered if he would be able to handle the pressures of the ceremony. Others worried he would do something embarrassing for the Academy or tarnish the prize itself. But on December 10th, 1994, John Forbes Nash received the Nobel Prize in Economics during a ceremony in Stockholm, Sweden. He accepted his award from King Carl Gustaf himself. In 2001, John and Alicia Nash remarried. The same year, the film A Beautiful Mind was released, and the Nashes experienced a surge of fame. The film took some creative liberties, although it's understandable why they did. For instance, John Nash never experienced visual hallucinations in real life as he did in the film. However, adapting auditory hallucinations to film seems like it would be a nearly impossible task. So replacing them with visual hallucinations so that viewers also believe the psychosis seems like it was a good idea. In one scene, Nash is arguing with Parcher, his hallucination from the Department of Defense, And Parcher begins yelling at Nash, telling him how useless and how worthless he is. And that scene is a great illustration of what my patients describe to me about their voices. The voices aren't positive, they're not cheerleaders. They're usually telling my patients how terrible they are, how they'll never amount to anything, how no one can be trusted. In the film, John and Alicia remain married over the years, which we know isn't accurate. They divorced in 1963 and remarried in 2001, although they did cohabitate for many of those years in between. There were some other creative differences as well, such as Alicia being unaware that her husband was struggling with schizophrenia until he was hospitalized, when in fact, it was Alicia and Nash's mother and sister who had committed him each time. I can appreciate the reasons why they might make those changes, especially since movies tend to be wrapped up in about 2 hours, whereas real life, as we know, is vastly more complex. There are a few scenes in the film that resonate with me after working with people with schizophrenia. There's a scene when Nash is first hospitalized when he yells in desperation, "I'm being held against my will." And as viewers, we can see how terrified he looks. Sadly, this is something I've seen frequently in my patients. Many of them, when they first arrive, don't understand why they're at the hospital. So they believe they're being held against their will when they probably were present when a judge said they would be going to a hospital. It's heartbreaking to see when that happens. There's another scene when Alicia attempts to initiate sex with John, but he refuses and rolls over. We see Alicia go to the bathroom and scream in frustration. And this is also something that is very common. While psychotropic medications can be very effective in treating many symptoms of psychosis, they come with some unpleasant side effects. For many men in particular, a decreased libido is a primary side effect. It can feel very frustrating and emasculating for them, and some will discontinue medications for that side effect alone. I appreciated that the film added that in, since it really is one of the most common complaints for folks taking psychotropic medications and for their partners. After the movie was released, John and Alicia Nash became even more active with organizations that had helped Nash over the years, such as Catholic Charities of Trenton, the New Jersey Association of Mental Health and Addiction Agencies, the Mercer County chapter of the National Alliance on Mental Illness, and the Association for the Advancement of Mental Health. In 2002, John Nash sat for an interview from which much of the information in this particular episode is drawn. It was a documentary about his life and career called A Brilliant Madness. If you can find it, I encourage you to check it out. As the years went on, the Nash's son, John Charles Nash, called Johnny, was also diagnosed with schizophrenia like his father. Also like his father, the younger John Nash's struggles with psychosis made it difficult for him to live independently, so he relied on his mother. She worried about what would happen to him one day when she was gone. According to a Princeton University article by Morgan Kelly, on March 25th, 2015, John Nash was awarded another prestigious prize, the Abel Prize, by the Norwegian Academy of Sciences and Letters. Although he had already won the Nobel Prize in Economics for his work in game theory, quote, "For mathematicians, it is his seminal work in partial differential equations, which are used to describe the basic laws of scientific phenomena, that stands out as his most outstanding and influential accomplishment." Nash shared the award with his longtime colleague and fellow mathematician, Louis Nierenberg. In May 2015, John and Alicia Nash traveled to Norway to accept the Abel Prize from King Harald V. On their way back, on May 23, 2015, they were able to catch an earlier flight than planned, so they arrived at Newark Airport hours before their limousine was scheduled to be there. They had traveled with Louis Nierenberg's daughter, Lisa McBride, who loaned her cell phone to Nash to call the limo company. Unfortunately, the limo company wasn't able to make other arrangements for the couple. "You could take a taxi," Lisa told them. So John and Alicia hailed a taxi, and off they went. In an article for The Gothamist, Jen Chong writes, quote, The Nashes were in a taxi, going toward their home in Princeton on the New Jersey Turnpike when the driver, Tarek Gurgis, tried to pass a Chrysler in the right lane from the left lane. Gurgis then lost control of the cab, crashing into the guardrail in Monroe Township, end quote. The Nashes were ejected from the vehicle, and they both died from their injuries. John was 86, and Alicia was 82. Quote, Gurgis, who suffered non-life-threatening injuries, used to drive an ice cream truck and had only been driving his cab for 2 weeks, end quote. Such a tragedy that after a lifetime of overcoming the odds and building incredible resilience, that they would meet such a sudden and violent end. There was an outpouring of grief following the deaths of John and Alicia Nash, as people remembered the incredible genius of John Nash and the incredible strength and fortitude that Alicia displayed for so many years. Another question was, what would happen to Johnny, John and Alicia's son? An article published in June 2017 noted that Johnny continued to live in his parents' home in Princeton, where he had lived for 45 of his 58 years. Like his father, his hallucinations had started to diminish as the years went on, and as he continued to be treated with medications and regular visits from his treatment team. I'm sure it would make his parents happy to know that he's been able to live independently, even in the face of grief and loss. And that's where I'll end the incredible story of John Nash. I do hope you go back and watch the film, A Beautiful Mind. It really is such a lovely film, but it's equally important to look at the aspects of John Nash's life that weren't so beautiful. I always say that people are complex critters, and when we only look at one aspect of them, we lose so much of their humanity. Next week will be the last episode featuring people from Trenton Psychiatric Hospital. We'll discuss 2 criminals, one serial killer, one mass murderer, and how they both ended up in the hospital instead of in prison. As always, thank you so much for listening. We just passed 4,500 downloads and have listeners in 28 countries. I am so thrilled that you're listening and that you keep coming back. Please rate and review the podcast wherever you're listening, as it helps other people find the show. So thank you to those of you who have sent me emails requesting to get into the Facebook group. If you haven't done that yet and would like to, please send me a quick message at behindthewallspodcast@gmail.com. And remember, do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, do better. Until next time. Thank you so much for listening to Behind the Walls of the World Psychiatric Hospitals. Once again, I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Gallup. Cover image is by Christopher Payne. Check out my website at behindthewallspodcast.buzzsprout.com. Follow the podcast and learn more on Facebook at Behind the Walls Podcast and Instagram at Behind the Walls Pod. For questions or recommendations, email me at behindthewallspodcast@gmail.com. You can find new episodes every Monday on Amazon Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you're listening right now. If you like the show, please rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts. It helps other people find and listen to the show, and I would be so grateful. Please stay tuned for more episodes of Behind the Walls of the World Psychiatric Hospitals. Until next time.